Welcome to this YSL tutorial. In this session we're going to teach you the basics of working with maps in reporting services. We're going to start by showing you how to add a map to a report using the map wizard. We'll talk you through how to choose a map file, which is particularly important if you want a map of anywhere other than the United States. We'll show you how you can link a map to a data set in your report and run you through some of the few choices you've got for visualizing that data in a map. When we've got the map inserted into the report, we'll talk to you about how you can format and edit it. So I'll show you how you control the map viewport with some interesting properties for the geographers amongst you. We'll show you how you can create a colour rule to create some sort of form of conditional formatting in the map. And finally, we'll add centre points to the various regions in our maps and show you how you control those using size rules and colour rules and different marker types. So let's get started. For our first example, we're going to create a map which displays information about the number of films made in each country of the world. So each country is going to be colour-coded to show how many films were made in it. We've created a basic data set which includes all the data we're going to need, so it includes the country name field and the film name which we're going to count. I've also included a numerical field, the film's running time in minutes, just to show you a couple of the other things you can do when you're visualising data. Once you've created your data set, the next step is to insert a map into the report. And you can do that using the toolbox. Find the map tool and double click on it to launch the map wizard. There's several steps here that we're going to follow to build our colour-coded map. And the first step is choosing where your map data comes from. There are three choices. To begin with, you've got the map gallery selected. The map gallery is just a collection of maps that are installed along with reporting services. And as long as you live in the USA, well, you're absolutely fine. Unfortunately, we want a map of the entire world, and the map gallery doesn't contain one of those, so we need to use one of the other choices. The second choice here is the SSRS shape file. And these are just files that you can find from various sources. A quick Google search for SSRS shape files, which you can then download and then use to populate your reports. I've got a couple downloaded on this machine, which we're going to use to demonstrate our map. But before I select the one we're going to use, I want to mention quickly as well a SQL Server spatial query. SQL Server databases can store data of a type called geography, which can represent actual regions of the world or of a particular country, and you can write a query which returns that data, which will then generate a map. It's all very clever. We haven't got time to go into it today, but it's an interesting topic for a future video. What we're going to stick with today is an SSRS shape file. There's a quick hint here about how you can get hold of some extra ones. I've already downloaded mine, so I'm going to simply choose to browse for the map that I would like. It's a file called world.shp, and if I simply select this one and choose to open it, I already get an immediate preview of what that map contains. So once you've chosen which map you're going to use for your report, you can click the next button to move to the next stage of the wizard, and this is going to allow you to sort of modify the view of your map. It's fairly intuitive how this works. If you've ever used Google Maps before, you'll be right at home with clicking and dragging on the map to pan it around. You can also use these arrows to click to move it around as well. You can zoom in and out using the slider bar, or if you want it to a little bit more fine control, you can click on the plus and minus symbols. And you can also change the quality of the map itself. If you drag the slider towards the smallest size, that means that it will lose some definition in the outlines of the shapes, but will create a much smaller file size. If you want the best quality, of course, then you sacrifice the file size. I'm going to go with best quality in this example. I can do a couple of other quick things here as well. I can choose to crop the map as I have positioned it in the preview above, which will chop off all the unused areas when the map is created, which will save a small amount of data when you save the file. I'm going to check that box. And then optionally, you can also add a Bing Maps layer. Bing Maps is being Microsoft's version of Google Maps, I suppose. As long as you're connected to the internet, this can be quite interesting. I'm going to select this option, and I can choose one of 3 different types of maps to apply. If I choose, let's say, aerial to begin with, what should happen is, eventually, there we go, overlaid on top of my shapefile is a Google Maps layer showing sort of like a satellite view of the world. And interestingly, the further in I zoom, the more resolved that will become. It's quite a clever little tool. But for me, for this particular example, because I'm color coding my country shapes anyway, I don't want to get confused with the actual satellite view. So I'm going to turn off the Bing Maps layer. It's actually relatively straightforward to add it in again later on. So for this point, at this point, I'm just going to leave it turned off. And that's step 2. So once you've arranged the map the way you'd like to see it, the next stage is to choose what kind of visualization you'd like to display on the map. So I click the next button down here to move to stage 3. In this example, I can choose from one of 3 different visualizations. The default one is called Basic Map, which is actually fairly pointless because this won't allow me to connect to my dataset to show the number of films made or the total running time in minutes. All it does is display the outline of the map itself. Color Analytical will allow me to color code my country shapes based on, for example, how many films were made in each country. It's a bit like sort of conditional formatting in Excel. Bubble Map is another way to do the same thing. It allows me to show a different sized circle over the top of each country, and I can link that again to the number of films made in that country. I'm going to start with a Color Analytical map. It's actually fairly easy to add an extra bubble layer to my map later on. So I'm going to start with a Color Analytical and then choose Next again. So this stage of the wizard asks me which set of data I'd like to try to link to my map. And if I've already created a dataset in the report, I can simply select it from the list as I have done here. I could also choose to build a new dataset at this point if I needed to. I'm going to choose the film countries dataset which I created earlier, which contains the country name, film and film runtime in minutes. And then I can choose Next again. And here's the really important stage of the wizard. This stage lets me link a field in my data set to some data which is stored in the map itself. There's 3 panels here on this page of the dialog box. This first panel at the top lets me choose a field in the map and link it to a field in the data set. The second panel shows me a representation of what data is included in the map shape itself. And the bottom panel shows me the data that's included in my data set that I created earlier on. The very, very important thing here is the fact that the map shape contains a field called country name, and my dataset contains a field also called country name, and the data in those 2 fields can be matched together. There's a country, for instance, called China, unsurprisingly, in this map. There it is. And there's a country name in my dataset, also called China. So when I link these 2 fields together, it's going to match like for like. So to set that up, what I need to do first is check the box in the top panel next to the country name field from the map, and then in the right hand column choose the field from my dataset which contains the matching information, and that's going to be the country name. So once I've chosen how to connect my dataset to my map, the next stage is to choose which field I'd like to try to visualize. So to begin with, I've got the country name selected, which means the wizard is trying to display each different country in a different color, which is a bit pointless. But if I click on the drop down arrow here, I can choose from one of the more sensible options. What I'd like to do is count the film names. So if I select that option, I get a kind of basic sort of preview of what my map might look like. The color coding that's used by default has a specific rule. It's green to yellow to red, so low numbers are in green and then larger numbers are in red. But I've got a lot of choice here about what I can use. I can simply flip that around, red, yellow to green, so lower numbers are in red, higher numbers are in green, or choose from any of the other different color code types as well. This can all be changed later on, and you can even generate your own custom colors later as well. So I'm just going to go with a basic. I'm going to stick with white to blue for this particular example. Two more things I can quickly do. I can choose to display labels on my map. So if I tick the box, I can then choose which field from the dataset or map I'd like to display. So I could show the country names over the top of each country, or I could try to show the count of film names, so I could show the actual value over the top of each country as well. It's a little bit like showing data labels on an Excel chart. The last thing I could do, and I deliberately avoided this option, is choose a generic theme, or sorry, a general theme for the map. The generic one that's used by default has a fairly boring, bog-standard font and border style. There are several more interesting ones, like for instance Ocean, which gives it a blue tinge and a slightly more interesting curved border around the outside of the map. Again, all these things can be modified after you've finished the wizard, so it's entirely up to you whether you apply those. So those are all the stages of the map wizard completed. All we need to do now is click the Finish button, and finally preview the report to see what we get. And there we go. So there's a basic map with the colour coding in place, so lighter colours representing countries with few films, and darker colours representing countries with many more films. We have our data labels in position. All that remains is to tidy the map up and maybe add a few bells and whistles to make it more presentable. So now that we have the basic map created, I'd like to talk a bit about how to format it. Now I'm not talking about things you probably already know how to do, like change the font size and the border colour and the background colour, for example. But there are a few specific formatting options for maps that are worthwhile mentioning. So I'm going to head back to the design view, and I'm going to find this easiest if I use the properties window. So I'm going to hover over the properties tab on the right hand side. I'm going to make sure that's pinned in place. Now if you don't have the properties window available, head to the view menu at the top of the screen and choose properties window, or just press F4 on the keyboard. And I also want to make sure at this point that I've got the entire map selected, not just a thing inside the map. So you can see that if I click on, for instance, the map title, then the properties window is showing me basic properties just for the title. If I clicked inside the sort of shaded area here, that selects something called the map viewport. What I want to select is the entire map itself, and the easiest way to do that is click just in the sort of pale, the blank border of the map around the outside. So the first unique property for a map is its anti-aliasing property, or anti-aliasing if you're in the States, I suppose. People who are into their computer gaming will know all about anti-aliasing. What it's designed to do is to smooth off the rough edges of pixels, so that instead of lines appearing jaggedy, they appear neat and smooth. Now this is really a quality setting more than anything else. Mine's set to all, which means I've got the smoothest lines possible. If I change my anti-aliasing property to none, you might be able to see that the edges of my shapes will become a little bit more jaggedy, a little bit more sharply defined. It's not much in it really in such a zoomed out map, but yeah, you can find that if you want to improve or decrease the quality of your image, you can change the anti-aliasing property. There's a separate property associated with the text anti-aliasing as well, so for smoothing the edges of fonts it's set to high by default on my map. If I change it to normal, for instance, you should see the slight change in the way the text appears. There's not much in it, but it's neat to be able to play around with that, something you can't do in other normal reports. Now the next few properties are for the geography geeks amongst you, and they're all associated with what's referred to as the viewport of my map. I can access these properties from either the full list of map properties by finding the viewport section and expanding it, or I could also see this in a slightly shorter, more dedicated list by clicking somewhere inside the border of the map itself, and you can see that I'm now looking at the properties for the map viewport. So there are a few things that we can do here that will hopefully please the geographers. The first thing we'll do is turn on the meridians and parallels, basically like grid lines effectively, showing you longitude and latitude. If we expand the meridians section in the properties window, there's a hidden property, so at the moment these lines are turned off. If we change the hidden property to false, we'll see the vertical lines appear. If we Do the same thing for the parallels section. We can change the hidden property from true to false, and we'll get the horizontal lines appearing as well. I can collapse that section. Another potentially useful thing, I suppose, although this will make more sense to the geographers than it will to me, is to change the projection type for the map. The projection type is choosing which system is used to draw effectively a 3D sphere onto a 2D flat plane. So the default one that's selected here is called, I'm not even sure how to pronounce it, Mercator. If I wanted to change that system, all I need to do is click on the drop down arrow and choose a different one. I think one that makes a big, enormous difference is the one called Hammer Itoff or Atoff. If I select that option, you'll see that the whole map is completely redrawn in a different way. The meridians and parallels will be redrawn as well, trying to show you roughly how that three-dimensional spherical object is being represented now on a flat two-dimensional plane. For the purposes of our demonstration, I'm not sure that's a particularly useful projection type. I'm actually going to switch back to the Mercator projection, which will make it much easier to see our countries. But it's just a couple of useful extra properties that will hopefully allow you to show your map in exactly the way you want. What I'd like to do next is modify the colour scheme that's used on our map to represent the different numbers of films made in each country. So to do that, I need to use the Map Layers panel to make it appear. I need to click once inside the map region and then once again, and the Map Layers panel should appear over at the right hand side. I've already got one layer in this map, which is called a polygon layer number 1 as it turns out, and the polygon layer represents the outlines of each of the individual countries. What I'd like to do is modify its colour rule, so I can do that by clicking on the drop down arrow next door to the layer and then choosing the polygon colour rule option. Now on the dialog box that appears, there are 4 ways to colour in your map. The one that's selected at the moment was the one that we decided upon when we followed the wizard right at the start of the tutorial, and we chose to colour in each country based on the count of its film name with a colour scheme from white to blue. There are 3 other choices here. If I chose Apply Template Style, that will clear the colours from the entire map, so that basically doesn't visualise the map by colour at all, which is no point using that in this example. I could also choose to visualise my data using a colour palette. So this example, I simply have to choose which predefined palette of colours I'd like to use, and choosing a different one will modify the colours in the background. The one that we've just seen, visualise data using a colour range, you can choose a start, middle and an end colour, so you can do lovely things like perhaps go from hot pink into lime green, for instance, and reporting services will decide on all of the intermediate colours between the 2 or 3 that you've chosen. The final option gives you the most choice, however, visualise data using custom colours. If I choose this option, then I can actually add as many or as few different individual colours as I like by clicking the Add button and then selecting which colour I want to use. So I can do that a few times, adding various different colours until I've got enough. One more. There we go. Once I've decided which colour system to use, it's worthwhile quickly checking to see how those are represented in the final map if I click OK and then preview the report. I ought to be able to see how reporting services have decided to assign the various colours that I've chosen. So I can see that the pale blue colour that I chose to begin with has been assigned to countries with 1 to 3 films in them. Then the second colour is for 3 to 4 and so on and so on. It actually hasn't used the 5th colour that I've chosen at all. So what I'd like to do next is control which colours are used for which range of numbers. I want to control the colour bands. So to do that, I need to head back to the design view and again use the colour rule properties dialog box from the map layers panel. Once a dialog box appears, I need to head to the Distribution tab in order to change the way the colours are assigned to different ranges of numbers. And I've actually got several choices for how to separate my colours into different bands. The default option here is set to optimal, which simply means that reporting services will decide on what's the best way to divide the range of numbers into different colours. But we've got several other choices as well. The first one here is equal interval. Now what reporting services will do with this example is divide the range of numbers, the count of film names, into portions with an equal value between them. If I can quickly click OK and maybe demonstrate that in a quick preview, what I ought to see happen this time is that my colour bands have an equal value between the bottom and the top end, so there's a difference of 42 between the bottom and the top of each band. The problem with this example is that because one particular country, the United States, has so many more films in it than all of the other ones, I effectively only see two different colours, the very, very lowest one and the very, very top one. So let's head back to the design view and head back to the colour rule properties dialog box again and head back to the distribution tab. The next option here is called equal distribution. Now what this option tries to do is create bands so there will be an equal number of data points in each different band. If I click OK and then try to preview that report again, I would see a completely uneven distribution of numbers, but what Reporting Services tries to do is make sure that each band is equally represented. I'm not sure it's been quite so successful in that example there. So back to the design view again, and perhaps the best way to assign numbers to different bands is to actually just do it yourself. If I head back to the distribution tab again, and then finally choose the custom option, I can now create my own ranges of colours using the buckets list. To do that, I simply need to start adding in bands and then start to set their start and end values. So I'm going to begin with a bucket which begins at 1 and ends at 2, and then I can add another bucket which begins at 3 and ends at 4, say. It is possible to overlap bands as well, by the way, so I could say from 1 to 2 and then from 2 to 4. The bands are evaluated from top to bottom, so if if a country had 2 films made in it, then it would use the first band rather than the second. So let's add another band there, and this time we'll go from 4 to, say, I don't know, 10, and then another one, we'll say 10 to 50, and then one final one, 50 to some arbitrarily high number. You can also calculate that using an expression, by the way, so you could calculate the max of films made in each country, but I'm just going to do it the easy way for this example. If I click OK, then finally, and choose to preview my report one more time, I ought to find that the legend now represents my own specific brand of bandings, and I get a reasonably good distribution of the different colours that I've selected. Another potentially useful thing I can do to my map is display the centre point for each country. I can do that by clicking on the drop down arrow next to my polygon layer and simply choosing to show the centre points. Now to begin with, that appears to make a bit of a mess of my map, and in fact if I preview my report, I'm going to see a bit of a mess. I get a single centre point for every single country in the map. What I'd really like to do is turn off the centre points for those countries with no data. So to do that I need to head back to the design view and then click on the drop down arrow next to the polygon layer again. Now the easiest way I've found to do this is to set a size rule for my centre points. So if I choose this option in the menu, I'll see a dialog box which allows me to determine which size I want my markers to be. Now I don't just want every marker to be exactly the same standard size. I'm going to choose to visualize data using size. And if I then choose a data field to present, that's going to be the count of film name again, I can now start to choose a minimum and a maximum size for each marker, but more importantly here, I want to be able to choose the default size for markers with no data. So rather than setting a size of 10, I'm going to simply set that to 0. The start and end size options, by the way, simply determine how small and large reporting services will draw markers for countries with data. If I click OK at this point and then preview the report, I have to see a somewhat tidy report, so countries with no data don't display any circles at all, and I get a different sized marker for countries with different numbers of films. Now that my centre points are displayed properly on the map, I've got all sorts of other options available to change their appearance. If I head back to the Design tab again, just to go back to the idea of the size rule, I'm going to go back to the drop down arrow next to the polygon layer and choose the centre point size rule. Hopefully you'll see, just as there was with the colour rule for the polygons, there's a distribution tab, and I can choose to change the distribution of my sizes in exactly the same way as I did with the colours earlier on. So I can add buckets which set a start and end value and carry on in exactly the same way I did earlier. I forget exactly what ranges of numbers that I used last time. Let's go with this. Finally 50 to, I think 1000 was the maximum one. If I click OK, yeah, there we go. If I preview the report now, I've got a bit more control over which size is used for which particular country. I can also assign a colour rule to the markers. If I head back to the design view again, I'm going to go with a slightly different colour rule to the polygon colour rule this time. Click on the drop down arrow and then choose centre point colour rule. Again, I've got the same 4 choices as I had with the polygons. I can choose a specific colour palette or a colour range. I'm going to choose some custom colours, again, to visualise my count of film name. And I'm going to add red and yellow and green, so like a basic sort of traffic light style system. Notice that I don't have to visualise the same field with my centre points as I do with my polygons. Maybe I could use this to show the total running time in minutes, for example. Let's stick with the count of film name for now. Head back to the distribution tab, and again I can set a different set of buckets for my centre points. Let's go with a slightly different approach this time. Let's go between 1 and 10. And then between 10 and 50, and then between 50 and 1000. If I click OK, and then the design view of the map looks absolutely awful at this point, but if I preview the report, things should look a little bit more clear. One thing that isn't particularly clear is the legend on my map at this point. I'm getting every single rule that I add to either the polygon or the centre points, I'll get another set of options in the legend. And my colour band here is looking a little bit messy here as well. So what I'm going to do is head back to the design view. Easiest thing to do is just delete this option completely. If I select and then choose to delete it, it won't appear on the map anymore. The next thing I'd like to do, I think the indication of different colours is useful, but I don't think an indication of size is particularly useful. I think it's fairly obvious that the bigger the marker for the centre point, the more films are released in that country. So I'm going to turn, or at least take this out of the legend. If I go back to the drop down arrow next to the polygon layer again and choose centre point size rule, there's a legend tab, and I can simply choose to not display my rule in any legend at all. If I click OK and then preview the report one more time, that should make for a much cleaner and tidier looking map. Another potentially useful thing I can do with the markers on this map is set a transparency effect so that I can see the countries in the background. You can see the UK here is completely obscured by the size of the marker. If I head back to the design view, click the drop down arrow next to the polygon layer and choose to view the colour rule again. For each of the colours that I selected earlier, I'm going to click on the drop down arrow and choose more colours, and on the dialog box which appears, I can choose to set the transparency of that colour to, let's say, somewhere around about 150 or so. That's good enough. If I click OK, and then the same thing for each of the other colours. And one more time. And if I finally click OK and OK again, when I preview the report, I ought to be able to make out the background of the countries behind the markers. I think all that we need to do for this particular map now is to generally tidy it up, perhaps turn the grid lines off, reposition a couple of the items in it, and resize it. So back to the design view one last time. To reposition items in a report, very similar to if you've worked with charts and graphs in reporting services, click on an item inside the map and then click and drag on the reposition cursor. You see that you can only dock these items to particular positions around the border. I'm going to drop mine to the bottom left hand corner there. To resize the map itself, really straightforward, make sure you've got the map itself selected, and then you can click and drag on the resizing handles to resize it. If you want to remove any items, for instance the map title perhaps, you can select that and delete it. If you wanted to zoom in on the map or reposition it within the border, you can do that in a couple of ways. You can reposition the map itself by clicking and dragging around. If you want to zoom in and out on the map, you'll need to use the Map Layers panel to do that, and use the options down at the bottom, so you can choose to zoom in a little bit more. And then finally, I want to turn off the grid lines. I showed you earlier on that you could do that using the dialog box. You can also do it by right-clicking in the background of the map and then choosing to switch on and off the different grid lines. If I finally preview the map one last time, I ought to see a much clearer, cleaner view of the number of films made in each country in the world. If you've enjoyed this training video, you can find many more online training resources at www.wiseowl.co.uk.